Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com with another one of these educational videos, and this one, or audio. This one is going to be talking about monopolies and just sort of the concept of monopolies, what are the problem with monopolies, solutions, etc. So in economics, the idea of a monopoly is a situation in which you only have one provider. So basically you only have like one provider of gum, and that's the only one that exists. Now, people's concerns with monopoly is that if there's only one provider of gum, one of the things that having many competitors and many providers of something do is that if they try to charge too much money, then what's going to happen is that some other competitor will charge less and undercut them, and that kind of keeps prices in check. Also, if they try to reduce the quality of their product, then again, some competitor will come in with a better quality of product, and that keeps quality and price in check. So the idea is that in order to maintain market share in a competitive market, basically you need to have, you constantly need to be worried about price and quality of your product. So if you're not offering the best quality for the best price, you're quickly going to lose market share and possibly go out of business. Okay, so that's the idea there. The question is a monopoly always going to behave like a monopoly? So monopoly price theory, or at least the way many libertarians look at it, and I think the economic data bears this out, that typically when you see monopoly pricing power, these are typically monopolies. These are particularly firms where there's very high barriers to entry. Okay, so it's very hard for a competitor to come in, oftentimes not because of natural reasons, but oftentimes because of government-imposed reasons. So basically, generally what happens is that you have like some sort of new industry, there's no regulations on it, so then like everybody jumps into that industry. Then you have a kind of a few winners, and then what happens over time, there's a call for regulation for an incident or something, and then what happens is that those big players who know there's going to be a bunch of rules now written that they're going to have to follow, they get involved in the writing of the rules to make sure that the new rules are easy for them to follow, but really because they already built up, they've already invested and whatnot, but that the cost to, if you were a new entrant into that market, that the cost to deal with those rules would be so prohibitive, it'd be almost impossible to go start a new company from scratch in that particular industry, which then limits their competition greatly and then gives them that sort of more monopoly pricing power to charge a little bit more, offer a little less quality. We see this in like telecommunication companies, etc., where basically those barriers to entry are really high because you can't, basically government kind of has all these different barriers as far as your ability to build on the ground and whatnot. So that's typically the kind of monopoly that libertarians are worried about, that government barriers, either through taxation, through regulation, and through other barriers, basically insulates a company and gives it monopoly pricing power. Now, let's say someone becomes the only firm in a particular sector. Now, a monopoly isn't just bad for monopoly's sake. Again, those specific conditions create the ability for bad monopoly behavior to exist. It is possible that someone just has such a good business, that such a good price, such a good quality, that they have a monopoly, that they're the only ones who provide it because nobody else can figure out how to be cheaper and better. Okay? That's not a bad thing, because the minute they raise their price, now there's room for entrance to the market. The minute they offer a lower quality product, there's room for an entrance to the market, because someone can enter that market and provide that cheaper price, whatnot. The barriers to entry aren't necessarily there. Okay, and it is possible that you naturally have a monopoly of that sort, so someone who naturally becomes a monopoly, but maybe you do have medium to higher natural barriers of entry because of, let's say, different capital costs. Although in today's world, the capital costs for most industries, for most projects, are a lot less than what they used to be, because more and more of what we consume is digital versus physical. So you're not talking about kind of everything requiring you to build to build factories, to build a bunch of equipment. Most things that people do nowadays are digital, require much more human capital, much less physical space. So a lot of those barriers to entry don't necessarily have the same salience in most places as possible. But let's say they did. Okay, you have that natural monopoly that somehow occurred, and the barriers to entries do exist because there are high capital costs in this particular industry. Well, generally what happens over time, that particular, even though they may have a monopoly, they may be extracting a higher profit because of that, it's probably not going to necessarily be long-lived, because any industry is going to invest in innovating to lower its own costs, to increase its own profit margin. So it's going to invest to try to reduce those costs that it has, and over time, it'll inadvertently lower the cost so much that it'll invite new entrants to that market, because now the technology will be there to come in and compete. Okay, so a natural monopoly, absent any kind of government barriers, whether it's through sort of really oppressive intellectual property regimes that just go beyond the pale. So some people believe in intellectual property laws, some people don't, but I think a lot of people can agree that in a lot of times, sometimes a lot of intellectual property regimes in many countries go too far, providing too much protection for too long. That could be it. Again, regulations that require people to make all sorts of different things, the cost of complying with those regulations, the legal liabilities it creates, all these kind of things are usually what kind of keeps other entrants at the market. So, and then what happens with antitrust laws, the reason why a lot of libertarians are very skeptical of antitrust laws is because oftentimes they're used very politically, because it's the politicians who kind of oftentimes pull the levers on when they get used. So oftentimes it's the big company that may not necessarily be exercising any kind of monopoly power. They're not necessarily raising prices or lowering quality, but but they're so successful that they become an easy political punching bag. Because when you see a company like a Google or an Uber and they just become very successful, very big, people always just look for reasons to be like they're a bad actor kind of pretty quickly, without taking things into full context and really thinking about sort of what would be the alternative if they didn't exist. So then the result is you basically end up making claims of antitrust. But the purpose of a lot of times, or at least the idea behind antitrust laws, was that you would use it to break up companies that are exercising monopoly power. Not ones that might be able to, or not ones that theoretically are there, or ones that you can somehow just get people to feel are there, and that's what often happens. And again, one of the few places that you can kind of see a more struggle in sort of the argument is in telecommunications companies. But then even companies like that, what happens is over time they become obsolete, because nowadays the ability to do wireless without or internet and telephone communications without having to use physical wiring in the ground is becoming more and more through satellites, through wireless interact. The technology is getting there where basically a lot of that physical infrastructure that gives telecommunication companies so much power is going to dissipate. And oftentimes if you did have a free market actor that did accumulate that much power in a product that required that much capital intensity, people are going to try to innovate a way around that capital intensive procedure, and eventually the market will open up. Because if there's an incentive, if you're that monopoly player, there's going to be a huge profit margin, and that profit margin gives a huge incentive for everybody else to figure out how to break you up. There's already a huge profit motive to break you up. Cool. So basically that's the idea behind sort of how libertarians look at monopoly. So hopefully this kind of gives you a little bit more perspective on the issue and answers your questions.